Medieval Europe wasn't just cautious about cousin marriage, it was consumed by it. Not a vague taboo, but a legal grid reaching to the 7th degree later paired to the 4th. Priests counted cousins, popes sold dispensations, annulments erased heirs, and dynastic plans collapsed, policing bloodlines to curb clans and channel loyalty elsewhere. The roll of parchment isn't just a list, it's a horizon. The bell has tolled as the priest unfurls it, edge darkened by oil and thumbprints, and the couple before him leans in, hopeful and careful, the bride still twined with a ribbon in her hair. He traces the kin chart, a web of names and lines, cramped Latin little crosses where godparents tie souls together. People in the pews exchange glances, waiting for the verdict of this ledger on their own lives. He counts ties: fathers, cousins, mothers, uncles, a sister's child half a generation away. 7 in older years, later 4. Each link is a potential bar to the altar. If he finds one, an oath by a godparent recalled from a festival long past, or a marriage by proxy whispered in a tavern, the ceremony stops. Sometimes a neighbor sharper at the register than the priest can stride to the door and shout their kin, and the room collapses into silence. This wasn't superstition on a whim. It was a disciplined, bureaucratic obsession that threads itself through daily life. Kinship charts decide who can hold land together, who can press a claim on a title, who can sit beside whom in council without scandal. Families learn to navigate the maze. Remarrying a widow might supply a hearth's warmth, but could also forge an affinity that rendered her children illegitimate in law. Priests and notaries kept careful tallies, lords consulted lawyers, as generals consult maps. The result was a social cartography in which affection, alliance, and legal standing overlapped and sometimes collided. The obsession produced odd consequences. People developed rituals to skirt rules, exchanging godparenthoods to cement bonds, claiming distant kinship to justify unions, and communities cultivated sharp memories of who had danced at whose wedding. Theologians argued fiercely. Some moralists declared certain sexual acts worse than incest, revealing how the imagination of sin shaped the social order. Ordinary people understood the leverage these rules offered. A clever mother could block an unsuitable match by whispering kinship into the right ear. A rival family could search parish registers for a stray link and unravel a dynastic plan. When an illicit link emerged, the human cost was immediate. Weddings were broken off at the altar, dowries trapped, and children caught in a legal limbo that could strip them of inheritance and name. Entire political alliances were redrawn on the basis of a counted cousin. What looks to us like a morbid fixation was for medieval communities a tool, messy, merciless, and profoundly ordinary, that shaped who loved whom, who ruled, and who survived. The web of kinship wasn't just a diagram on a wall, it walked with the people who walked in the corridor outside a bishop's chamber. Picture a young count named Ansel of the Loire eyes on a bride from a rival house, a transfer of patience and pride between two great families, inches from a treaty. The moment they spoke of betrothal, the tabula, blood, affinity, spirit, promise, began to hum with potential fractures. The line that had worried them most wasn't the dozen cousin threads in the 7th degree. It was the stubborn thread of a godparent's pledge, the memory of a long-forgotten betrothal, the pledge sealed by a priest's hand at a christening. The bishop, tracing the spiderweb, saw not romance, but leverage. If this match would break under an old vow, a papal dispensation could either seal the bond or sever it and redraw the map of power. Dispensations were never just legal loopholes, they were currency in disguise. A noble house could lean on the Pope's mercy to bend the rules when a marriage promised alliance more than affection. And the price wasn't merely silver, it was patronage, favors, and the bishop's own influence traded like stock in a volatile market. A bishop could threaten nullity not because love failed, but because he wished to tilt a council, secure a rival's resignation, or extract a favorable dispensation for a client who could pay in land, titles, or gifts. The web thus moved from private longing to public leverage. A couple might be ready to marry, but a memory in a scribe's ledger, a godparent's weight, or a bishop's hunger for control, could pull the curtain closed with a single decree. The consequences sharpened in daily life. A court waited calculating which kin still mattered, which godparents could stand as witnesses, which past promises might rise like old skeletons to block a match. For the poor and middling orders could be issued in the same breath, as mercy a dispensation bought with coin. The peasants never saw, or an annulment pressed as a political calculation that left a widow or widower to mend a broken alliance in the markets and monasteries. Secret lovers faced not merely social shame, but the hollow ache of a plan that vanished, replaced by a prudence that favored dynastic survival over private happiness. And while the spiderweb offered a certain order, it also turned ordinary affection into a calculated risk, a legal gamble where every kiss could become a cross, every vow a potential chain. So the medieval world learned to live inside a legal intimacy. Love and alliance became human choices wrapped in ecclesiastical paperwork, the tabula's threads binding lives as surely as they could liberate them, and sometimes snapping them in ways no heart could predict. On a raw morning in a village chapel, the parish priest unrolls a rough parchment, and by the light of a single window traces lines that are not about saints or tithes, but about blood. He is drawing a kinship chart, names linked like a family tree given a thicket of knots, because canon law has turned love into arithmetic. For 3 Sundays, the priest reads the banns, each syllable a probe, hoping someone will stand and say, "Wait, that's my cousin." If no one does, 2 people can marry. If someone objects, the church has tools, proof, testimony, or a path to forgiveness called a dispensation. Wealthy families treated these rules like taxes to be managed. They hired clerks who knew how to lay out pedigrees that flattened awkward loops of ancestry into legible lines, and they sent petitions to the papal chancery, where scribes scraped quills and corrected mistakes with ragged palms. In Rome, a bull, cold wax-heavy seal could be granted for the peace of realms, and suddenly a second cousin match was lawful provided the purse was open. The papal office promised order, and it meant money. Elsewhere, people improvised. The poor had no clerk to draw their tree. They begged a rival parish to marry them, or they swore secret vows at dusk. Because in medieval law, consent made a marriage true, and a whispered, "I take thee," could outrun pedigrees. Couples slipped between parishes where no one remembered who begot whom, or simply lied at the font. Priests turned a blind eye when kinship charts were fuzzy, or when tithes mattered more than scandal. This is how the law met life, not as a cage, but as a sieve. The system had teeth and favorites. Dispensations favored the powerful and literate. Mistakes in a petition could invalidate a union, and even a papal bull was no shield against gossip. Rivals resurrected charges of incest, like a weapon not out of piety, but to wound. In some cases, the church itself admitted error. Records corrected marriages, re-examined reputations, shredded. Above all, these practices show medieval people as nimble readers of rules, bargaining with priests and papers to keep families intact, or to break them depending on which way power flowed. One record after another shows a noble paying for a seal, while villagers waited years for a humble priest's nod. Sometimes the delay ruined inheritances, left widows vulnerable, or sent lovers into exile. The law was a tool of order, but also a currency of power traded openly and secretly across Europe and rumor. When a bishop pronounced the marriage void for consanguinity, it was not a private grief, but the folding of a map. In 1152, the annulment of Louis VII and a leaner of Aquitaine looked like theology on a register, neat Latin about forbidden degrees of kin. In practice, it was a disaster in slow motion. The queenship unstitched the dower, evaporated the small girls who had once shared their mother's bed, awoke to a new legal name. No lawman wanted to speak aloud. Weeks later, a leaner married Henry Plantagenet, and half a realm slipped from the French crown, as if someone had opened a door and let the wind take it. Courtiers counted alliances. The way merchants count coin, a marriage annulled for blood ties could be bought, ignored, or weaponized. For kings and popes, The incest statutes became chess rules, a convenient excuse or a sword. Philip II tried the same blade with Ingeborg of Denmark marrying, and then seeking to set her aside. Popes, bishops, and entire courts were summoned not to protect love, but to adjudicate leverage. The arguments were scholastic, the rhetoric pious. Beneath the Latin, the cost was human dowries reclaimed like bad loans, client families stripped of patronage, children turned into bargaining chips. What the law promised, moral purity, often translated into political expediency. In a stone parish, a century later, the same rules sounded absurd up close. A miller and his bride stood before the consistory with the smell of meal on their sleeves, while a neighbor thin with a grudge swore that their grandmothers had been sisters. Witnesses bumbled names half remembered from a funeral 30 years gone. One pointed at a scribbled genealogy, and another at a ring the bride had once worn. The judge, tired and hungry like any man, peered at the testimony and at the ledger. He could accept a family story and send the couple back to bed, or he could pronounce the marriage void and consign a woman to the church porch and a man to the road. The cottage, the stock of tools, the rights to the mill pond. Everything could hinge on whether two dead women had shared a roof. The canon law that smelled of incense in cathedrals smelled of damp straw here. It promised order, it delivered pain. Incest rules, obsessively applied, became instruments of leverage and uncertainty in lives that only wanted continuity. Accusations of forbidden kinship could ruin reputations, unpick friendships, and reshape borders, because medieval obsession with blood often decided who inherited land, who kept a roof, and even who survived politically alive. The thread ran deeper than the courtroom, weaving through kitchens and beds and fences that separated kin from kin by mention of a line in a ledger. Families learned to count not just miles between houses, but degrees of trust, and every decision a judge made carried the scent of consequence long after the ink dried. The priest blew a candle stub to a smear of soot on his thumb, spread the hymnal flat, and traced a crooked family tree drawn in the margin by a grandmother. Two young people waited on the nave bench, cheeks flushed from sewing linen. The priest squinted, testing arithmetic by feel as much as rule. In a village where everyone was kin twice over, the church's seventh-degree net caught nearly all. It was not theory but habit. Godparents who were in-laws' fields passed among brothers, children gossip, braided kin into a map no match could escape. Often the rector looked the other way. Love and local peace outweighed canon law, or sent the couple up the chain, a route of signatures and payments that might turn forbidden into permissible. In town, the rule became a ledger line. Merchants treated dispensations like investments. Marry your cousin, keep capital, in-house pay the fee to the diocesan court, and hope no rival cried foul. City life turned kin into strategy, preserve stock, control guild seats, consolidate shops on a single street. A dispensation, inked, stamped, expensive, was insurance against law and rumor. But it worked only if no one shouted scandal. A louder rival could push a public inquiry and twist a private tie into a lawsuit. A widow seeking to steady a faltering mill might lean on kin. A cousin twice removed offered as a political prize, and every signature a vote in a quiet duel. Among noble houses, consanguinity was both weapon and shield. A childless marriage could be cured by counting cousins. A cousin twice removed mattered more than tenderness. Whisper of a great-grandmother could stall an alliance, summon inquisitions, and unmake treaties made at banquets. Bloodlines were strings to pull, claim kinship, and force an annulment or deny it, and lock an heirless estate in your grasp. The castle corridor where deals were struck smelled of wax, wine, and quiet calculation. Clergy bore the grunt work. Parish priests flipped memory and registers, coaxing names from old women and shaky baptismal entries. Bishops balanced pastoral conscience with the politics of powerful families pressing for favorable rulings. In chancelleries, papal officials turned intimacy into files and fees. Petitions sealed sworn testimonies and judgments that read like accounting, annulled, dispensed, paid. Everyone adapted. Couples learned loopholes, merchants budgeted for dispensations, nobles weaponized pedigrees, and clergy developed shorthand for kinship puzzles. Adaptation was not escape. The net stretched and tightened, on land, on airs, on seasons, reminding medieval Europe that private ties were politics as often as marriage. The next petition would test where power and kinship finally meet. The quill still hisses across parchment, but now the ledger wears a heavier weight of consequence. In the cramped chancery of a cathedral, the entry is not a wish whispered between two lovers. It is a dossier they must present to a registry of kin and law. The line disp, granted, shifts from a private mercy to a public hinge, a dispensation to bend a family tree that stretches to the 7th degree or beyond is weighed, argued, and stamped with the bishop's seal. Lateran IV did not merely prune the net of kinship, it turned marriage into a procedure with banns to be proclaimed, repeated, and witnessed, a ritual of public legitimacy that required clerks to become archivists of lineage. The court's calendar marks the petitions, the examinations, the tiny margins where a fee is paid, and a witness swears to truth. The romance still flickers, the pageantry of a bride's gown, the groom's cautious smile, but it is now tethered to a ledger, to a docket, to a map of who may marry whom and when. And yet the machine is not a trapdoor that slams shut. Its gears grind, but they also accommodate human need and cunning. A couple might still slip through the cracks, a clandestine vow spoken in a roadside chapel memory, preserved in a priest's careful note, a bargain struck in fear or favor. Records could be bought or bullied. A penniless tailor's daughter might meet a priest in a doorway and gamble on a memory kept by discreet witnesses. Rome held the decisive prerogative. Dispensations could be argued, purchased, or denied at the Curia, and the Pope's judgment could rewrite two families' future with a single parchment. For clerks and bishops, the new procedure delivered work predictability and authority. For ordinary people, it delivered a path where affection had to pass through bells, bands, and receipts before it could pass into bed and home. By the later Middle Ages, Europe had learned to live inside these rules, a marriage announced in church, a petition filed in ink, and seal, a dispensation weighed in a scholar's mind, and a curial clerk's sum. The romance endured, but it traveled through a public eye and a public record. The love that once leapt private now negotiated its fate in public, with consequences that could lift a couple into alliance or plunge them into dispute. And so, the story moves toward the next consequence: how the kinship webbed the cost of proofs and the pressure of precedent, reshaped families' status and power in a world where every vow carried a stamp. At dusk, a parish priest bent over a table, a single candle guttering as he traced lines between names, Jacob, Agnes, 2 generations back, and murmured calculations about degrees of kinship. Around him, the village's future hung on that little chart: who could marry whom, who needed a dispensation, who must find a spouse beyond the field of familiar faces. This ritual, tedious, pious, obsessive, wasn't just about sex or sin. It was a slow cultural engineering project. By insisting that marriages be checked, recorded, and sometimes forbidden, the medieval church built a new social layer between blood and bed. Families that once matched by proximity and clan loyalty now encountered a third party: the parish, the diocese, sometimes even the curial bureaucracy in Rome. Marriages became public acts requiring witnesses, oaths, and written proof. For couples, this could be liberating or crushing. A young man in love might be forced to look farther afield if his beloved was deemed too close a relative. A widow might seek a papal dispensation to secure an alliance otherwise blocked by kinship rules. Papers accumulated, petitions, licenses, dispensations, and with them, a new habit: private desire translated into public record. Consider for a moment the small, stubborn detail of the process. Banns read aloud in 3 successive Sundays, the names announced with the precise distance of kinship spelled out in the margin. A priest tapping a margin of the parish register, as if it contained a map of everyone's future. A couple might dream of a bond rooted in affection, yet the law demanded a lineage certificate, a witness who could swear to generations of connection, a line of parchment that could be pressed into the bishop's hands. If the family lines were too tangled, a suitor might travel to a bishopric far from home bearing gifts, seeking a dispensation that could bend kinship rules toward a sanctioned alliance. The costs, time, money, social risk, were not trivial, and they often fell hardest on those without land or influence. Change didn't erase older ties overnight. Local loyalties, neighborly networks, and regional customs persisted. Historians still argue over how radically these laws reshaped society. But look at the fingerprints out. Marriage became more normal in much of Western Europe. The very notion that kinship could be regulated by clerics took root, and arrangements once handled by kin councils migrated into registries and courts. Our modern institutions bear that lineage. The cousin taboo in much of the West, marriage licenses, waiting periods, mandatory blood tests, or genetic counseling. These are distant echoes of clergy counting cousins by candlelight. Where clan elders once brokered unions, now the state or clinic stands between kin and marriage, insisting on forms, proof, and procedure. Think back to that opening couple. They needed more than love. They needed charts, witnesses, a priest, sometimes a pope. That is the story, how medieval Europe turned desire into a dossier, and in doing so rerouted loyalties, rewrote maps, and left us with a marriage built on memory, record, and rule.